Today I'm conducting a couple of interviews into the effects that COVID-19 have had on the real estate industry, both from a property management / leasing perspective and a sales perspective. As a financial planner, I'm often advising clients on issues related to real estate matters, and when I need help, I go to the experts. And I have a couple of experts here with us today to help us navigate through these interesting times. And let's cover off on property management and leasing first. So to those of you who know me personally, you'll no doubt recognise my first guest today. But for those of you who don't, this is my lovely partner, Leanne Jopson. The reason I'm interviewing Leanne today is, well, firstly, it's convenient because she lives here, but secondly, because Leanne has, over 20 years of experience in the industry now, is an absolute guru in my opinion. I know I'm a little bit biased, but she certainly knows her stuff and is the perfect person to help us understand what the hell is going on with leasing and property management at the moment. So Lee, please explain, I guess, your current role in the industry and maybe give us a very quick bio of your experience as well.
Okay, yes, I work specifically in property management for the last 20 odd years, a few years before that in general real estate. Specifically for the last few years, and I hope for many more to come, I'm working as the National Director for Property Management for Metropole Property Strategists.
And so therefore you'd have quite a few clients, I imagine.
Couple of thousand, yeah,
Okay.
quite a few clients. I guess in terms of bio or qualifications, I have a Bachelor of Business and I'm a fully licensed estate agent.
Cool, so you know your stuff.
Yeah, you'd hope so.
Okay, and in all your time in the industry, have you seen anything have an impact on landlords and tenants, and I guess your industry more broadly, like COVID-19?
Short answer, no. Look, have I seen recessions, multiple recessions? Yes, the ones we had to have, the ones we didn't want, the global financial crisis, the introduction of GST into the Australian economy, elections, prime ministers, heaps of them, a whole heap of different things that have affected the industry, but nothing quite like COVID affecting the industry. And I guess there's three primary things that make it different. One, it was very quick. Like there was no lead up to it. It was just here, and we had to deal with it very quickly. The second thing is when you've had changes in legislation, changes in taxation or fiscal policy, when you've got anything like that happening, there's a build up to it. Even the recessions and the global financial crisis, there was forecastings and there was an element of choice or input that went into it. Whereas in this particular instance, we've had no choice, no input. And I guess last but not least, definitely not least, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it's affected everybody. We really are all in this together. As in it's affected tenant, landlord, business owners, property managers, every aspect and every element. Yeah,
and I guess in terms of those effects, I mean, we don't need to be all property management experts to understand what they are on the face of it, that obviously many tenants have either lost all or part of their income, they can no longer pay all or part of their rent. The flow and effect of that, of course, is that landlords now are having trouble paying their mortgages. Banks have very generously, and I do say that sarcastically, allowed borrowers to defer their payments, but really in no way does that help landlords address that shortfall because they have to pay it back at some stage, aren't they? So we have this massive issue involving a number of parties all with competing interests. How did you work through this at the start, particularly in light of the fact that there was little to no guidance from the National Cabinet?
That's a really big question.
Give us the short summary.
Let's break that down. Well, from a comical standpoint, we were here. So we spent a lot of time attached to the ABC and waiting for the Prime Minister's address. So there was a lot of information that we were just desperate to get. I guess in practical terms, yes, you don't have to be a property expert to work out that if a tenant doesn't have any income, the tenant can't pay the rent. You don't have to be a property expert to work out if you're not getting rent on your investment property, it makes it incredibly hard to pay your mortgage. That's there. I think the other thing that sort of the next step on that, or the next evolution of that, is that it wasn't normal insofar as the very best tenant the very best tenant doesn't want to not pay their rent. But it wasn't just that they'd lost their job or they needed to change jobs or they were between jobs. Their job just wasn't there. And with no prospects. And I think the other thing is in a number of cases, and you've got to love Australians for this, in a lot of cases there were people doing the exact same job for less money. Right? Equally, the clients that we work with, I work with, they're well educated, they know about having buffers, they know about having all of those kinds of things. But the issue is you have the buffer in place and you've calculated your buffer based on your tenant not being able to pay your rent, or you calculate your buffer based on me losing my job. What you don't ever envisage is that those two things can happen simultaneously. And so that's where I think National Cabinet missed the boat. They're going through the announcements that were made initially when the government came out and said, hey, we're putting a 6-month moratorium on evictions for this long. That was a real relief because we'd had several really responsible tenants that had lost their jobs, and their immediate knee-jerk reaction was to go, oh my goodness, I need to give my notice to vacate. I'm not going to be payable the rent. These are people that have been in long-term employment, never missed a payment, and for the first time in their lives were finding themselves without an income. And they were in panic mode. So initially, that announcement of moratorium evictions was a really good one. Unfortunately, humans are humans, and there was also the collective that went, great, we can't be evicted for not paying our rent, ergo we're not going to pay our rent. Not so great in that instance, and it took a bit of backtracking.
And I remember that time, you and your colleagues at work were just inundated with a whole lot of requests from tenants, obviously, panic calls from landlords as well, thinking the same thing. So anyway, thanks ScoMo for that one. That really put a cat amongst the pigeons. But I guess now, you had a couple of months to try to deal with, how to navigate these waters. So let's talk about some practical advice now for both tenants and landlords. From a tenant's perspective, when is it time to go to your landlord, and what should the approach be?
Okay. From a tenant's perspective, it's really simple. As soon as you have any inclination that you're going to be unable to pay your rent, you need to get on the phone to your property manager. And that can be as simple as, look, my hours have been cut, I've lost my employment, this is happening. I may still qualify for JobKeeper, I may still qualify for JobSeeker, or I've got this happening or that or something else happening, but I just want to let you know that this situation has happened. That enables your property manager to give your landlord forewarning. Right? And a lot of these cases, and one thing the government did well was come out straight away with JobKeeper and JobSeeker. That was good. It steadied that down.
Absolutely.
But it just enables the landlord to be better prepared. The unknown is always the thing that you fear the most. So telling your landlord early is definitely the way to go to get that communication going.
And from a landlord's perspective, once that communication comes in, how should they deal with that?
Again, your property manager is on the phone to you saying, hey, your tenant's indicated that they are in some kind of financial distress, or they're thinking, first one is don't panic. And particularly in this situation, remember that your tenant doesn't have all the answers, so there's no way that your property manager is going to have all of the answers as they're conveying it. But that's when the time is to start looking at your options, to go and see your financial planner, to talk to your accountant, to talk to your bank, and see what options are available to you in terms of if you need to, postponing or waivering your mortgage. The one thing that the government did come out with was the potential to waiver up to 25% of the land tax if you waived rent for the tenant.
Sure.
I'll talk to that a little bit later as well. But that's the first thing. The next step after that is when you have good indication that your tenant's not going to be able to pay the rent, then really at that particular point in time, your property manager, or there's certainly them available throughout most of the institutes or the training organisation, is have some kind of formal financial application for financial hardship. That should ask questions like, when did you lose your job, how much is your or your hours were cut, how much has it been affected by. It's a bit crystal ball, but when do you think you're going back, what's your decision, what is your position, and also what do you need, what do you think as a tenant you're going to need to get through this. There were some tenants that just simply needed to be allowed to be late for 2 or 3 weeks until their JobKeeper or job seeker payments came in, and then they were going to be fine. So there's no need to go, waiving rents and doing all of that kind of thing if that's not what your tenant what your tenant needs. So asking that in question is important. But just because they've asked for it doesn't mean you legally have to give it either. And you've got to you sort of go through your own pros and cons in that process, and
because really the only, as you mentioned before, the only legislation, I suppose, or the only real guidelines we had from either federal or state government was about the moratorium on evictions. There was nothing else really, was there? So everything else that's happened has really been a negotiation between landlords, tenants, with you guys in the middle trying to assist with that. Correct?
I should probably clarify that information that I've given so far is predominantly about residential rents. There were some guidelines that were given about commercial. In fact, they're commercial arrangements, and I do manage commercial property, and we have guidelines about what to do there, what was fair, what was proportionate, what commercial tenants needed to show you to show their hardship and that kind of thing. But really, ScoMo came out and said tenants and landlords need to negotiate. Great. Without that fundamental framework, those two parties have never negotiated well. So without a framework or understanding, it wasn't great to get through that. I think the other thing that's important to recognise is commercial landlords and commercial tenants they're used to negotiating. They have parameters and rules, and the boundaries in which you're negotiating. And
almost more of a symbiotic relationship than residential.
Absolutely. And it's not personal relationship. Whereas between a residential tenant and landlord, you're talking about somebody's home. And often we forget that. And there's often a really emotional connection. And speaking from my personal experience with my property management team, that was really hard because we had people that were genuinely scared. This is a roof over their head, their children's head. Their children were going to be homeschooled. How do they keep their kids safe? How do they keep a roof over their head? So when you're starting to go into that realm, you get a lot of fear, and a really, when you're trapped in that sort of personal space, it's hard to negotiate.
Absolutely. And I guess that probably leads to my last question for you. When you have tried and reached the point where the landlord and the tenant just cannot find a compromise, what should they do in that situation, or what avenue is then open to mediate?
Okay. I'm the National Director, so I could answer that question based on a number of states.
Absolutely. Let's maybe stick with Victoria.
Let's stick with Victoria. So in Victoria, there's a couple of really specific things that have been set up. So let's sort of just run through that. Okay. First step, try and negotiate yourselves. Second step is that if your tenant, your landlord, via your property manager, and really use your property manager during that process to take that personal aspect out of it.
Absolutely.
If you can't mutually agree to something that's acceptable kind of thing, then the next step is to use the Consumer Affair Victoria's mediation services. Now there's 2 levels of mediation that have been established. The first one is very simple. It's a bit of a chat. The Consumer Affairs member rings the applicant, so either the tenant or the landlord can apply, rings the applicant, has a chat with the applicant about where they're at, goes to the respondent, has a chat with them, and normally by simply answering some questions, by having a third party that's not seen to represent either tenant or landlord, you can normally come to an agreement, because there's a lot of misinformation out there as well, and a lot of confusion, because what you get in one state, what's on the news are quite different. And normally we're certainly finding that's probably all it needs to be able to get people together. But there is the next step, still in the mediation realm, and that's where you actually go to a conflict resolution person, and there's the 2 people in the room, not just separate phone calls having, separate. And we are doing phone calls at the moment rather than face-to-face meetings. But this is where they're both there and discussing it. So that's a higher level of mediation. If at that particular point in time you cannot come up with an agreement between the parties, then the conflict resolution mediator basically makes the decision to send that to VCAT. Basically says, we cannot resolve this situation amicably between the two parties. So we've tried mediation. So now you can apply to VCAT. You go off to VCAT, and VCAT basically makes the decision for you. They can decide to reduce the rent. They can decide to consider it as arrears. They can choose to put you on a rental payment plan. So waiver, deferment, but ultimately that decision is taken out of your hands, and it's applied, and it's a binding legal order.
And it's always on a case-by-case basis, really, isn't it? So once again, there's no sort of strict framework that we can adhere to or understand.
No.
And so finally, Lee, how is the leasing market looking? I mean, with all this going on with COVID, it must have had some sort of impact. How should landlords approach this time?
Look, it's funny because this is a financial services video, but ultimately they need to look at it mathematically. The reality is that COVID happened, we weren't allowed to do open for inspections, therefore every property that was on the market at the time just stopped. And then we were allowed, and then Airbnb stopped, so there was a whole influx of Airbnb properties now coming back onto the rental market, and we couldn't show them, right? So there was just this build of properties. Then also we were allowed to show only vacant properties, so you had to immediately. Normally you've got that 14-day lead-in Victoria. Instead we had to wait until they were vacant before we could start advertising and opening them, and that resulted in a number of properties coming onto the market quite quickly. In addition to that, the people that would normally be looking, the normal potential tenants, weren't sure about whether they were going to have a job tomorrow. And so there was a real build in the number of properties available. Almost the exact opposite of the sales market where there's limited stock. Instead, you've got the opposite happening in rentals, a whole heap of stock. And so, as a result, the rents dropped. Basic supply and demand kind of thing, the rents dropped. What we're now seeing is the restrictions are lifting. We're able to go back more and more to normal open for inspections rather than private appointments. There is a greater level of confidence that's coming back in. People are now starting to say, hey, we're going to come out of this, and they're starting to come back in and look. But has that been sufficient to suddenly push the rental market back up? No, it hasn't. In addition to that, it's difficult to move around at the moment, so you're finding naturally, whereas people could move out of one house one weekend and into the next, that vacancy period is becoming longer as they coordinate. The other thing that we have to factor in is whilst the restrictions are going to lift over the next month, and that's going to make it better. What we're also going to find is that all of those properties that we weren't advertising because we weren't allowed to do open for inspections in occupied premises, they're all now going to come up onto the market as well. So I really can't see that market rebounding quickly. And in addition to that, we're not allowed to do rental increases at the moment. There's no rental increases. In fact, any rental increases that would come into before the September 29 have been null and voided by the Victorian government. So as a result, that's going to have a flow-on effect. I think it will be, this is crystal ball stuff, but I really see that we will be looking at probably February, March in Melbourne, which is traditionally Melbourne's peak time for leasing, February, March next year, before we see that the market will steadily come back to norm, but I think it'll be February, March next year before we get back to the real norm. What is the norm? And start to see those rental prices go. So I guess when you're making the decision about how much you're going to waiver or how much you're going to give as a deferment, as much as you've got all the considerations that you as a from a financial services point of view, what you've also got to consider is, okay, if this tenant was to vacate, what are my costs? And the costs are not just the costs of engaging your property manager. The costs are, the property's physically going to be vacant by the time it gets shown right now. So there's also going to be 2 or 3 weeks at least without a tenant in there because of that vacancy period. And in addition to that, probably you're going to be signing up that tenant for the next 12 months at a lower rent. So it's really worth doing the math and making sure you're making a good decision, particularly if you've had a good long-term tenant who's been paying the rent, passing their routine inspections with flying colours,
Yep.
you've really got to do the math on it and decide what is your best possible solution. Nobody wants COVID-19, nobody wants to be affected by it, but we are, and there's a reality, and doing the math is what's really important in the market.
Absolutely. Well, they're great insights. So thank you very much, Leanne, for your time and expertise today.
Thank you.
And to everyone tuning in, stay tuned for the second part of my interviews with real estate experts. We'll have the sales one next. And please follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn to stay tuned.